corridor being selected through a state refuge. So the next person on the platform here is Ron Somerville, who's going to go through the statutory and regulatory framework around a crossing. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. When I got this assignment to work on this particular, the introduction to this part, the most important part Alex is going to handle, tell you how he did all the analysis, but I'm going to try to give you a little background on how we got where we are. Honestly, when I looked at this in total, I said this is a perfect example of the definition of insanity. What is that? Doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Because it's amazing, as I went through all the background materials available, how much of it applies to the next step each time. In 2004, there was a preliminary scoping report done, and they said the biggest problem with the second crossing is the refuge, funding, and the environmental costs. I was going to move this thing up here. As indicated by others, the refuge was created in 1976. The refuge had several points to it that were extremely important. For one, it said the municipality could get a crossing through the refuge. However, they had to abide by certain conditions, like a planning effort, to minimize the impacts. Unfortunately, in 2004, there was a survey done, and the most difficult issue they came up with was the wetlands. Again, we're running through the same. This insanity continues. As pointed out by Matt, once you get through this Pell process, it'll go on to the environmental protection issues and NEPA and the environmental impact statement being required in order to go ahead with a funding program, which the city has identified several times, and that is using highway monies to pay for this crossing, or 90% of it. In 2007, there was an alternative comparison and the group recommended that Vanderbilt be the preferred alternative. Unfortunately, it didn't get very far, but I wanted to give you, this is 2007. The advantages were a short crossing, less impact to the refuge. Sunny Point is an important area to wildlife, less conflict with hunters, less costs, less airport conflicts. The Sunny Point conflicts, longer crossing, crosses high-value estuaries, conflicts with hunters, conflict with wildlife, higher costs, and impact to the Sunny Point neighborhood. That's the first time concern for the neighborhood came up in the studies. It also identified potential problems with the airport. In 2010, there was a bond issue, which I think most of you remember, going to build a solid fill causeway across the flats from Sunny Point. That went down to defeat in the polls. It was going to be funded by the city. 33% were for it, 67% were opposed to it. We're now at, as Matt pointed out, the Pell process. It's a planning environmental linkage. It has 2 levels. We've gone through the first and we're in a draft second level funding. The purpose is a public involvement, eliminate unreasonable alternatives, involve stakeholders, technical committees and discussions, public review, public surveys. Unfortunately, when they did their first survey, they didn't show the refuge on the map, so nobody knew the refuge was there. The other one, which we've continually pointed out, is the need for a bench road. And you think about it, a bench road costing probably less than this bridge would provide access to the west side of Douglas and would provide some sort of better transportation for the 4 people along the existing road. And, but anyway, every time we brought it up, Dow said that they weren't going to consider it this time. In other words, we'll build a bridge and then we'll think about how we're going to get people to the backside of Douglas. The Department of Transportation has consistently testified that the North Douglas Road is not capable of handling the traffic that this will generate. So you got to wonder what is the priority. We have consistently proposed something that is required in the Transportation Act of 1976, says that you can't go through a refuge, sanctuary, or some area created for wildlife if you can find a reasonable alternative. Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting that. Go back to that. That's what you see there is what the present refuge statute says. As you can see, unless he's considered preferential under Article 8 of the state constitution, but subject to the requirements for plan specifications and approval under 1620. The point being, it did acknowledge the fact that further roads through the refuge might be contemplated. The management plan was required by the statute, and it said same thing. Transportation corridors, but they must have been demonstrated there's a significant public need for the corridor which cannot be reasonably met off refuge. That the use of refuge lands are avoided or minimized to the maximum extent feasible, including use of subsurface or elevated no-fill corridor options where feasible. That's one thing we've really continually hammered on, and that is they've got to be with 24-foot tides, 24 and -4, you got 28 feet moving in 6 hours. A solid fill corridor or crossing is just not going to work. They're going to have to all be unpiling, and there's been quite a bit of agreement on that particular issue, but so far Dow has refused to accept that. And it requires that public access to the refuge is maintained and all avoidable impacts to the refuge and to refuge resources are fully mitigated through restoration, replacement, other compensation. I wanted to say something, though, it's important, and that is this mitigation thing. We're constantly being approached by people saying, well, we can mitigate any damages that might occur in this crossing. But the problem is, I'm sure Saul could address that at some point here. Margaret gets up and agrees to talk. That there just isn't much mitigation land available anymore. When we extended the airport, which was a mandatory obligation, they mitigated the loss of habitat and it was taken up, Salt did most of the purchasing, and guess what? They have essentially gobbled up as much of the mitigatable land available so far. Now why I'm running through this, it's important that you understand how much background and how much support we have in statute and within the governmental process. It says the Secretary shall not approve any program or project that requires the use of any land from a public park, recreation area, wildlife, or waterfowl refuge, or a historic site unless there is no feasible and prudent alternative to the use of such land. That's going to come up in another discussion we'll have a little bit later. And 2, such programs shall include all possible planning to minimize harm to such park, recreation area, wildlife, and waterfowl refuge. That's really, that particular language occurs a lot. My rumbling through all of the documents required, I got a hold of the Federal Highway Administration and asked them about when we go to the next level after they get done with this Pell process, and that is the EIS. And they said, well, we've contracted with the Department of Transportation to, in fact, do our part of the NEPA process, the EIS, and I kept querying as to, well, what does that mean? Do you have anything to say about it or anything? No, they said, we have nothing to say about it. It's totally contracted. Well, that's not true. DOTPF will not make any determination that an action constitutes a constructive use of publicly owned park, public recreation area, wildlife refuge, waterfowl refuge, historic site, without first consulting with the Federal Highway Administration obtaining their approval of such determination. So they have, in essence, a veto if they want to use it. The problem is they don't tell anybody that. So that's going to be very important as we continue this process, that we continue to have the access to this sort of control. When you look at the city of Juneau has been consistent the last 30 years and what they're pushing for. They want access to the backside of Douglas. Certain special interest groups want access to the backside of Douglas. And they want to develop North Douglas if they can. Obviously, they're interested in land that they can convert to low-cost housing. I'm sure most of you know that low-cost housing in Juneau is not cheap. So it's going to be expensive to get there. I just wanted to quickly, for my responsibility, the Pell study has, from our standpoint, has not been productive. Now it may be, as Matt has pointed out, they may decide to turn a leaf over on the other side and do something right for a change, but so far they have virtually ignored the professional input that the Mendenhall Wetlands Study Group has provided them. We gave them tons of different references on things that relate to mitigation, these sorts of things. I've already told you that. When they did the first survey, they didn't even show the refuge on the survey map. I don't have to read it to you. Advisory committee meetings are difficult. Anyway, I'm skipping over stuff that we'll cover later. The major issues that we had and if anybody back there is a copy of what we submitted and level 2 screening. We get nothing from Dow in terms of bridge design, for instance. Is it going to be a solid fill? Is it going to be on piling? The things that I've mentioned before. They actually did field studies in September. What was it, 7 days? And that was their wildlife studies. Now, this is a new form of insanity, doing year-round studies on wildlife in one 7-day period in September. It doesn't take much to realize that that's probably not very valuable when it comes to some species. What's the alternative? And I'm just about done. The alternative is they're trying to eliminate Salmon Creek because it's the only off-refuge one, which, remember, it said if an off-refuge one is available, they got to take it. They're trying to get rid of it as an option. They're going to, the word we got was, if in fact there's a 8.2 tremor goes through, earthquake, and 1 in every 10,000 year flood, it's going to take out the Salmon Creek interchange. Well, that's probably true. We're kind of wondering if maybe they ought to move the hospital because we won't be able to get to it either. I also wanted to mention something for some of my friends that are more familiar with the impacts, but maybe the priorities aren't right here. Maybe somebody might be able to use some of that money to fix Suicide Basin, maybe fix the dam that's going to break up here in 10,000 years, and put a bench road in on Douglas Island. Anyway, that's a start. I'll assume you get on to Alex.
Thank you, Ron.